In 1920s, you had said that a writer from Scientific America wrote that coyotes aren't worth the ammunition you use to kill them, but we should kill them anyways because they're the original Bolshevik.
Yes.
How did it go from these animals that were seen as deities by the Native Americans to, by the 1920s, they were so hated by people, and there were propaganda campaigns from the government to make us hate them. Like, how did we get there?
Well, it's a somewhat long and convoluted story, but I'll try to condense it into as few words as possible. So, native people, because they did not have domesticated animals, other than the native people of North America had domesticated wild turkeys. And so the Pueblo people of the Southwest, for example, had domesticated turkeys in cages in their villages and pueblos. Most North American people before the arrival of Europeans didn't have domesticated animals. And so they were free to look at predators as animals that were kind of exemplars for them. And uh, wolves and coyotes and mountain lions and bears were considered to be instructive animals. And the coyote, especially among all of them, had been picked out by some long ago native group, and the idea obviously spread across almost all of North America that the coyote was sort of an avatar for humans in the world. And so Old Man Coyote, as I've argued, became really North America's first and oldest literary figure in all of these marvelous stories that Native people told about how North America came to being and how humans learned about the world, how they learned about fire, how they learned about death. It was Coyote, this deity sacred figure, who was the animal that had taught them about all those things. So, native people having no domesticated animals and free to look at predators as guides and exemplars, as hunters in the world, thought of these animals as sacred. And in the case of Coyote, in fact, as a deity figure. Europeans, though, came out of a 10,000 year tradition of having slowly domesticated not just crops, but also animals of all kinds. They had domesticated cattle and horses and sheep and goats and camels and on and on and on. And so when they arrived in North America 500 years ago, they brought all these animals with them. They brought sheep and goats and cattle and horses and hogs. And those creatures, of course, had been targets of predators in the old world. And when they were arrived in North America, Europeans looked around them and saw all these viable wild predator populations on the East Coast, primarily wolves and mountain lions. And they immediately set about the task of trying to get rid of them. I mean, the first environmental law ever passed in North America by old worlders was to put a bounty on wolves. And so it was a very early reaction to the presence of these canid predators like wolves and later coyotes that led us on this road that ultimately by the 20th century gets us to something like that Scientific American article. I mean, nobody knows anything about coyotes when we first start encountering them. Lewis and Clark write a kind of a natural history description of them eventually, but nobody quite knows exactly how to react to them. But we gradually began to form the impression that, well, they're just a smaller version of a wolf. And we know that a wolf is the enemy, it's enemy number one. And so these coyotes must be somewhere along the lines of an arch enemy we need to get rid of. By the 1920s, then, even the scientific community, as you mentioned with that Scientific American article, had weighed in with the idea that we need to kill them on sight everywhere we see them. And it's your patriotic duty to do so because even though they're not worth the ammunition that it takes to kill one, they're the first Bolsheviks. They're the original communists. And of course, in 1920, we're 3 years after the Russian Revolution, and communists are supposed to be a threat to the entire world. So since we've got them here in North America, we need to get rid of them.
And bad reputation by association with wolves and Russians.
Yes, that's exactly it. Wolves and Russians.
Um, in 1931, Congress passed an act called the Animal Damage Control Act, which appropriated $10 million to exterminate coyotes from America.
Yeah.
Created a laboratory called the Extermination Methods Laboratory and launched a propaganda campaign with articles appearing in the Washington Post. I guess could you talk a little bit about just this massive effort? And it was also, there's a lot of money in propaganda here, but it was also something that's so cool to me is that it was this like um, arms race between the U.S. government, or like a race of wit between the U.S. government and these coyotes, because the coyotes could tell cause and effect from when we were using arsenic to kill them. So the government's like, well, we have to get smarter and create longer periods of dormancy of the poison, so they can't figure it out. But the fact
Yeah.
the government had like an intellectual arms race with this animal while propagandizing us, while putting $10 million into their extermination is, I guess, could you tell me about that whole thing?
Well, I mean, it's a crazy story, is it not? I mean, and it begins largely as a consequence of the success of the campaign against wolves. And one of the reasons it was possible to get rid of wolves, to drive them to the brink of extermination, extirpation in local regions all over North America, was that wolves, unlike coyotes, are much more strongly pack bonded. And the government hunters, I mean, what had happened was that the Bureau of Biological Survey, which became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, had realized about 1905 or 1906 that Congress wasn't going to fund them purely to study American wildlife for scientific purposes. And so they came up with a strategy of, okay, we'll make ourselves then into the solution to the so-called predator problem, which they successfully did by about 1915 when Congress began appropriating money for them to wipe out wolves, coyotes, mountain lions, and so forth. And they, by about 1925, they were completely successful at wiping out wolves because wolves, as I said, were so pack bonded that you could actually, if you caught or killed one member of a pack, you could use the scent glands from that animal and end up capturing every or killing every single animal in a wolf pack. Coyotes, on the other hand, were not so strongly pack based. And their response to this kind of persecution, as I argued in Coyote America, was to basically scatter across the landscape in pairs and singles and flee from persecution. And so the result of that was that by 1925, 1926, the wolf problem is no longer the major problem, so-called major predator problem. The coyote problem was, at least that's what the Biological Survey told us, the coyote is actually the arch predator of our time, as they put it. So they get Congress to pass this bill, the Animal Damage Control Act in 1931, giving them $10 million. And they said they could do it in 10 years. We'll wipe out coyotes all across North America. And of course, the way they were going to do it was to poison them to death. So they started out by using the poison that had worked so well on wolves, which was strychnine. But because strychnine, as you suggested a minute ago, kills these animals so quickly, coyotes, being as smart as they are, began to put together a kind of a cause and effect. They watched other members of their groups, of their packs, eat one of these baits, and within a minute or two, suddenly go into violent convulsions and die. And they put together enough of a cause effect relationship between the bait and the consequences of it that strychnine no longer was a viable option to wipe them out. And so this is when the Biological Survey and its labs set up to exterminate coyotes began coming up with a whole suite of new poisons. And the primary one they developed by about 1945 was one called 1080. And they called it compound 1080 because it took 1,080 tries to perfect it. But it had the consequence of producing a longer delay between ingestion and the result of the poison. And the idea was that coyotes were not going to be able to put together a kind of cause effect relationship between eating 1080 and then dying 3 or 4 days later from it. But of course, what you've introduced into the world then is a poison that kills these animals over a period of days. It causes them to lose their hair, the pads of their feet come off. I mean, it's a horrible kind of death, but at the time, Americans regard this as some of the hunters for the old biological survey put it, we've just defeated the Nazis, we've defeated the Japanese. Now it's time to go back home and wipe out those coyotes and win that war.
And these poor creatures just took so much abuse and did so much suffering. Um, could you talk a little bit more about the fission fusion aspects of their pack and how that is what humans are as well? And that's, this fission fusion strategy, when you persecute them, when you hunt them, their populations just explode all over the place. And I guess something related to that is the quorum sensing that goes on when females or when the pack howls.
Yeah.
The amount of pups they have is related to the population density that they survey through howling at night, which is just the coolest thing in the whole world, I think.
Yeah, it's all of these adaptations that coyotes came up with are really quite remarkable and really astonishing when you kind of step back and think about it. But they are coyotes are one of our best representations around the world of an adaptive strategy called fission fusion. And they evolved it, we think, because of the previous pressure that they suffered from wolves. Wolves, as big dogs, tend to attack coyotes as the smaller dogs. They dig up their pups from their dens and kill them. They'll run down. I mean, there are pretty horrific YouTube videos from Yellowstone of gray wolves running coyotes down, finally overtaking them and killing them. And so that harassment over at least the last 30,000 years or so, if not longer, led coyotes to develop this adaptation, which is found among only, the last time I read closely about fission fusion, there were only 19 species around the world that we believe had evolved this adaptation, humans being one of the others. But the way it functions with coyotes is that they can do very well as pack animals, sort of like larger wolves, in which case they're engaged in what's known as the fusion adaptation. And as pack animals, they can even, which they're doing in the South and East these days, they can even hunt deer. They can bring down particularly small animals or animals that are injured or old and have difficulty getting away from them. So they can actually hunt deer and larger animals as packs. But whenever they're harassed or persecuted, the coyote adaptation of fission fusion allows them to go into the fission mode, which obviously implies that the packs break up. And when that happens, singles and pairs of former packs tend to scatter across the landscape. And this is one of the reasons we think a kind of a driver of their expansion across North America. As we began trying to poison them into oblivion in the 1920s and 1930s, coyotes responded to that by going into a large-scale fishing mode, and they began to expand across North America, out of the West, across the Mississippi River. And now, of course, they're in every single state in North America except for Hawaii. And so that response is what spread them, along with obviously the elimination of their competitors, wolves, in the East and the South. But that's kind of their modus operandi for surviving this attempt to wipe them out. And as you suggested, one of the things they do, of course, is they can vary the size of their litters. And they do this through some sort of autogenic response to determining what the population of coyotes in a particular landscape is. And they often do that by sort of taking a census as a consequence of listening to howls and gauging how many animals are out there. The other part of that particular story is that when there are fewer animals, fewer coyotes on the scene because they've been poisoned or trapped or hunted with helicopters or whatever, it's easier for a coyote mother and her mate to raise all their pups to adulthood. When the coyote population is normal and they sort of have risen to the point of the carrying capacity of the landscape, sometimes they'll have a litter of 5 or 6 pups and they only get 2 or 3 of them to adulthood. But when there are fewer competitors out there, fewer other coyotes, then they can often get out of a litter of 6 or 7, they can get 5 or 6 of them to adulthood because there are a lot of resources available.
And so their persecution led. So how many states did they start out in when we started poisoning them and persecuting them and having them spread all over?
Well, we've got archaeological information that indicates that at times in the past, coyotes were east of the Mississippi River, at least for fairly small periods of time, perhaps. There's a coyote, there are coyote remains, skeletal remains, as far east as Pennsylvania, for example, from the Pleistocene. And we're pretty sure because of the presence of coyote genetics in red wolf populations, for example, in the South, that at a time when bison populations were spreading out of the West and into the South, which we know happened in the 1500s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, largely as a result of what's known as the Little Ice Age, and bison populations sort of spilled out of the Great Plains, that coyotes may have followed them because there is evidence, as I said, of coyote genetics in red wolf populations and in eastern wolf populations up around the Great Lakes too. But by the time we were really doing close natural history of the issue in say, the beginning of the 19th century, coyotes were confined to the first tier of states west of the Mississippi River and on west into California, but not into Oregon, Washington State, or very far northward into Alberta or Saskatchewan. They were largely, in other words, animals of the Great Plains and the Western deserts. And in order to see coyote populations, you essentially had to get to that part of the world. So it in effect, was just the states like from South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas westward. And then there's an absence area, particularly west of the Cascades in Oregon and Washington, and even in Northern California, not a great deal of presence. But by the middle of the 20th century, coyotes were not just spreading into the east, they were also spreading into the Pacific Northwest. They were going all the way up to the Arctic Circle, where Eskimo people, seeing them for the first time, thought that this was some new fox that had arrived on their doorstep. So, and today they are the first North American animal since the Pleistocene, we think, to begin crossing the Isthmus of Panama from North America into South America. So there are animals, these are animals that obviously are cosmopolitan. They can spread given the chance. And if you give them a chance, like persecuting them and then wiping out wolves so that they have new places to expand into, they can cover an awful lot of ground.
They just sound unstoppable. I wanted to talk about you had mentioned in Coyote America Adolph Murray, and the story you told is that he saw a coyote with a piece of sagebrush, and he was tossing it up in the air and catching it in a manner that he said it seemed like it was in love with being alive, and then
Yeah.
information was suppressed by his superiors. I guess could you tell me about what he saw and why it was such a dangerous piece? Why it was such a dangerous observation and it needed to be suppressed?
Well, this was Adolph Murray, who made that observation, and he was in Yellowstone, and he had been given. Here's one of the fascinating things about this story, especially in the 20th century, and especially in these years when Congress has voted a $10 million expenditure to erase coyotes from North America. This all happened before scientists had done any kind of work whatsoever on trying to figure out the role that coyotes play in the world, what their natural history is, where their populations can rise to in terms of total numbers. We had no scientific evidence whatsoever. And the Biological Survey, when the Society of American Mammalogists began pointing out to these guys at the Biological Survey, look, you're doing this without any science to back it up. The people at the Biological Survey decided, okay, then we'll go do science. And what we expect is the science we do is going to fully demonstrate that the coyote is the arch predator of our time and is deserving of being eliminated from the continent. And so they send out these two brothers, Olaus and Adolph Murray, trained biologists from the upper Midwest, who turn out to become real heroes of the conservation movement in the 20th century, in part because they followed the simple scientific precept that they were trained to, which was you let the chips fall where they may. You don't try to cause your science to be politically biased in one direction or another. You go out and try to figure out what's happening in the world. And so Olaus Murray was given the task of doing research in Jackson Hole in Grand Tetons Park and coming up with an account of what coyotes actually ate and what role they played in the landscape. And Adolph Murray, his brother, he was working for the Park Service, so he was hired to go into Yellowstone and do a very careful account of the role that coyotes played, because what he was actually given the task of was trying to figure out how serious a threat, how many pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep and elk calves, for Christ's sake, and mule deer fawns and all of this that coyotes killed, wiping out the animals that the Park Service thought drew tourists to Yellowstone. So Olaus does his piece in Grand Tetons Park, where he does a very careful scat study of what coyotes actually eat. And he publishes a piece of work in 1937 where he argues that, well, it looks like coyotes actually are not a threat to the elk population in Grand Tetons National Park, because it looks like what they eat are primarily rodents and rabbits. And as he began to assess the role they played in ecology, what Olaus Murray concluded, was that 90% of what coyotes do in the world is actually beneficial for humans, and the remaining 10% or so has no effect one way or the other. So he had, in other words, not demonstrated what the Biological Survey wanted him to show. And then his brother comes along and does this study in Yellowstone, and Adolph Murray says, wow, I can't find any evidence that coyotes really are having any impact on the pronghorn population, because pronghorns and bighorn sheep and mule deer have, who knows, thousands, maybe millions of years ago, already adapted to the presence of coyotes as predators of their fawns. And so pronghorns, for example, they always have twins. They have two fawns, one with the idea that it's probably going to be nabbed by the coyotes. But these animals don't seem to be affected by coyote predation. And then he has this story that you introduced to get us to all this, where he's standing, Murray is standing on a game trail in Yellowstone one morning, and he sees a coyote about 100 yards away trotting down the game trail towards him. So he just crouches down in the brush and lets this coyote approach. And as it's approaching, he realizes it's throwing its head back in a strange way, and he can't quite figure out what's going on until the animal trots right by him, and he realizes it has a sprig of sagebrush in its mouth that it's tossing into the air and catching the way you would walk along with a baseball or something and toss it up and catch it and enjoy the experience of playing with this particular toy. And what that made Adolph Murray realize was that on this beautiful sunny morning in Yellowstone Park, this coyote was in love with being alive. It was in love with life, and it was enjoying its life. And those kinds of things turned out to be uh, sort of verboten from the government agency that was trying to and was given the responsibility of wiping out coyotes, because they were trying to convince the American public that this is an animal that has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And so to put out a story that argues that these animals love being alive, I mean, that was just the kind of thing they did not, his superiors did not want out in the world. I mean, and Murray, this same guy, goes on to Denali, to Mount McKinley and Denali National Park a couple of years later, and studies the wolf relationship. Given the same task, he's supposed to be, we don't have any science on wolves, although we've almost completely extirpated them. And so he goes into Denali and does the same thing with wolves. And he ends up once again sort of trying to break through this old world kind of knee jerk reaction that all predators have to be killed as soon as you see them. And what he's trying to convey, not only about coyotes, but about wolves, is that these relationships he's seeing in Yellowstone and in Denali Park, coyotes and wolves, these relationships have been going on for maybe millions of years. And the reason they work so well is because the prey and the predators are so well adapted to these long-standing North American relationships. So he's trying to give us some sense that, look, we're Johnny come latelys here. We've only been here for 300 or 400 years. We can't just assume that we're going to fix everything when we arrive, because for one thing, we don't actually know how North America has worked.
Yeah, the New World is, in fact, very, very, very old.
Yeah, it is very, very old.